Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 14th of December 1924, what caused the Great Depression? A suspect is brought in for questioning. What is the future for London transport? Lord Ashfield has some ideas. Plus, we learn a bit about the scale of Britain's war effort, and Britain runs a successful immigration policy, although they don't know that yet. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. Parliament was reopened with the King's speech, in which, then as now, the government lays down its programme for the year to come. There are very few concrete proposals. There's an ongoing correspondence on the question of what should replace a rather unremarkable collection of buildings in what is known as the Broad in central Oxford. Many are worried that they will be replaced by some hideous example of modern architecture. Spoiler alert, the buildings are still there. Spoiler alert, when it comes to hideousness, the architectural profession had only just got going. I should point out that planning laws have nothing to do with this. The land is owned by the local council. The general election has taken place in Germany. The National Socialists were trounced, but the main parties are still having difficulty in coming to an agreement on the form of a coalition. In last week's episode, I mentioned that there had been an attempted coup in Estonia. This week we learnt that the president only narrowly escaped assassination at the hands of the Soviet-backed rebels. It is one of the eye-openers of doing this to learn that there is nothing new in the Russian government seeking to control its neighbours, or countries that aren't its neighbours. This week we learnt that the Soviet Union is encouraging natives in the colonial empires to rebel. With the First World War being fresh in people's memories, the Times is devoting articles to the events of 10 years previously. This week it was the anniversary of the Battle of the Falklands, not to be confused with the Falklands War. This was when two heavily armed British battlecruisers tracked down a German raiding squadron and, for the most part, sank it. Oddly enough, the article did not mention that the battlecruisers used up the majority of their ammunition in the battle. War anniversaries have also inspired a correspondence on the subject of which was the first territorial, or reserve, unit to see action in the war. The commander of the Northumberland Hussars is very keen, as am I, to press his unit's claims, but it would appear that the Ox and Bucks yeomanry just beat them to the punch. I have a personal interest in this, as my great-grandfather was in the Northumberland Hussars at the time. According to family legend, he showed up with a horse, and the Germans showed up with a machine gun. Most unsporting. He was pretty lucky, or unlucky, to be there at all. Field Marshal Kitchener, the War Minister, had a dim view of territorial units, and by and large shipped them out to quiet parts of the Empire. His view was probably not illuminated by the Christmas truce. All the photographs from that day involve soldiers from the Northumberland Hussars. In slightly related news, Krupps of Germany is suing Vickers of England for royalties related to the production of shell fuses made under licence by Vickers between 1914 and 1917. I think they are being ambitious, and very German. As you probably know, 100 years ago, they had the death penalty for murder. The final avenue of appeal was to the Home Secretary acting on behalf of the King. Anyway, this week there have been a large number of representations from the people of Hull on behalf of a man convicted of murdering a woman. The volume of the representations is unusual, which is odd because the case seems clear-cut, so to speak. The man, Smith was his name, was executed the next day. From murder to execution took 4 months. Your occasional reminder that they took that stuff in Magna Carta about justice not being delayed seriously in those days. As well as capital punishment, they also had corporal punishment in those days. This week a man was sentenced to the cat for importuning. In another case, involving the beating of a boy by his father, the judge regretted that the punishment was not available. There's been a severe fog in London, which has disrupted just about everything. From what I can work out, it seems this happens about 3 times every winter. In an article about American demographics, we learnt that the replacement rate, that is, the average number of children a woman needs to bear for the population to remain constant, was 3.8. Nowadays it is 2.1. Child mortality has come down. One family that can't be said to be failing in its duty is the Balls of Coventry. They have 9 children. And 1 room. We discovered this in the course of a murder trial. Mr. Ball was accused of killing Mrs. Ball's male friend. He was found guilty of manslaughter. The Balls' living arrangements are an extreme example of the housing crisis. On Thursday, The Times devoted an editorial to the subject, in which it was revealed that in 1905, a record year, Britain built 129,000 houses. It was 110,000 in 1923-24. That got me thinking, what is the number today, when there is a similarly bad housing crisis and it is almost impossible to build? The answer is, as best I can figure out, 188,210. Not the answer I was expecting. The only possible explanation I can think of is that this is to do with population. Then it was 44 million, now it is 70 million. Also, could there be a definitional issue? They are talking about houses. We talk about dwellings. Could they be missing out on flats? Unlikely, I would have thought. As further evidence of their housing crisis, this week it was announced that plans had been drawn up to convert Reading Jail, of Oscar Wilde fame, into flats. When one thinks of First World War generals, the name John Cowans does not come readily to mind. It probably ought to. He was Britain's Quartermaster General for the entire duration of the war. In the Times' review of his biography, it reveals that at the outbreak of the war he was responsible for supplying 164,000 men, and at the end of the war 5,363,352. It would appear that he was good at his job. He was also a controversial character, too much time spent in the company of other men's wives. The Great Depression was the worst economic disaster since the Black Death. Not only did it push millions into poverty, but it created the conditions for the rise of National Socialism and any number of quack economic theories. But what caused it? Our mainstream economic historians tend to give rather vague and unsatisfactory answers. Keynes's animal spirits, for instance. Austrian economists, on the other hand, are clear. The Great Depression, as with all depressions, was caused by an increase in the money supply. This led to a boom, which was inevitably followed by a bust. So I was intrigued to see this headline: US Reserve Bank Criticism. Now, a little bit of context here. Up until 1913, the United States did not have a central bank, and yet they prospered. How odd. But now they have the Federal Reserve. It is going about as well as you might expect. A striking criticism of the working of the Federal Reserve System in the United States appears in the New York Commercial and Financial Chronicle of November the 22nd. It appears that criticisms were made at the annual convention of the American Bankers Association at Chicago, which passed a resolution to the effect that the Federal Reserve banks had been driven, in order to earn their expenses and dividends, to compete for business with their own member banks in such a fashion that there was a danger that the operations of the reserve banks would accentuate the swings of the financial pendulum rather than keep them going too far in either direction. The Chronicle declares that the reserve banks are responsible for an enormous inflation of the circulating medium. The argument of the Chronicle is that nearly $1,000 million of credit would not have existed but for the Federal Reserve banks. I am not quite sure about the banks plural bit, and I am not sure why they, being a state enterprise, have to earn money, but the implication is clear. The Fed is stoking up a boom that will inevitably end in a bust, and what a bust it was. By the way, this is not the first time financial experts have been ringing alarm bells. See the 6th of May 1923 episode. Last week I spent an inordinate amount of time quoting sections from a series of articles on the subject of immigration. The last article in the series was published this week, and the Times marked it with an editorial. No nation welcomes the settlement within its borders of an alien population, living its own separate life and preserving its own characteristics from generation to generation. Give it time. Half a century ago, this East End problem did not exist. It dates from the cruel persecution of the Jews of the Russian Pale in the early 80s. The Times does not seem to have been reading its own correspondence articles. Their correspondent makes it clear that the problems created by immigration are small and in decline. The Jews who had established themselves among us before this great immigration had ceased to present a problem since the idea of attaching civil disabilities to religious beliefs was abandoned. They were Englishmen and English citizens like the rest of us. Fresh immigration is not now a problem. Net immigration in 1924, as we discovered last week, was 9,875. Politicians of today, please note. Talking about assimilation, it has this to say. What we have to strive for is the political and social assimilation of the Eastern Jews who came here a generation ago and of their descendants. Did they even have to strive? We want them to amalgamate in all but their beliefs with the body of the nation. You have the luxury of saying things like that if their beliefs are compatible with the political culture. And then they say this. We must not, however, increase its inherent difficulty by throwing open the gates to a flood of fresh immigrants, as foreign as their predecessors, to our manners and to our thoughts. I will refrain from comment. Last week I mentioned Lord Ashfield, chairman of United Electric Railways of London, in connection with the reopening of the City Railway. This week he gets to write an opinion piece. He begins by outlining some of London's transport problems. Factories are dropped down indiscriminately without workmen's dwellings. Docks are placed where there are no houses. The wholesale markets are in the most congested centres. They still are, but not for much longer. A week ago, in real life, it was announced that the meat and fish markets are to close. The warehouses are not necessarily at the docks or at the railway termini. Altogether, because there has been no design of the street system, and because there has been no zoning or area planning of the metropolis, the problem is much worse than it need have been. All I can say to that is just you wait until you do get zoning and planning. He then talks about all the things to be found underground. To construct the Piccadilly Circus station under the circus, it is necessary to dig first for buried remains. In channels cut across the converging streets, miners set to work to explore what is under the surface, and as they find pipe or cable or duct, they are marked and eventually placed away in a special subway, which must first be constructed all round the circus to take them in. The remedy for street congestion in London is the tube railway. It is the natural remedy. Others will prove palliatives only, giving false hopes of a cure. Hence the importance of a properly designed and expanding tube railway system. The slightly sad truth is that most of it has already been built. Street traffic at its best moves at an average speed of, say, 12 miles and at its worst of some 3 miles an hour. No change there. He goes on to talk about how roads are funded out of the rates or local taxes. For the underground street in its special character of a tube railway, however, the local authority, as the highway authority, accepts no responsibility and makes no provision. The undertaker of such a railway must finance its construction and development, and must depend, as things stand, on recouping himself wholly from his traffic. He has exceptional expenses to meet, such as a street transport undertaking has not, and in order to secure a satisfactory traffic, he must generally charge the same fares. The bus operators, of which Ashfield is one, do not have to pay anything for the congestion they cause. The tubes, on the other hand, do have to pay rates on their stations. If there is a street beneath a street, then measures must be taken to coordinate the traffic of the two. so that the traffic which can more advantageously use the underground street shall be induced to do so, and that which can more advantageously use the surface street only shall be kept there. This problem of coordination is not an easy one, and it cannot be attempted until all forms of transport are brought under some single control. The situation which has grown up in London today must have made this clear to all. I find this astonishing. As I said, Ashfield is a bus operator, the operator of the biggest bus company in the capital, and yet he finds it hard to coordinate between bus and tube, which is odd because my understanding is that he did quite a good job with buses being used as feeders for the tube. The streets have been filled with omnibuses which have not only abstracted from the underground railways a proportion of their existing traffic, but have also, apparently, deprived them of any chances of growth. The omnibuses have congested the important central arteries, with the result that the general speed of movement on the streets has been grievously reduced, and unless all the facilities for the movement of traffic are used to the fullest extent, the local authorities will be compelled to embark on extravagant and unnecessary expenditures on street improvements. I hate to point this out, but if the central arteries are congested, then that affects the buses as well. It makes the tube a better option. But let us imagine that there was some sort of market in road space. Surely that would mean less traffic, higher speeds, and buses being more, not less, competitive. The only method is to devise some pool by which all means of transit, contributing their quotas as they earn them, can look to a common fund for their support, so that all means of transport, instead of having individual selfish interest, may have a common interest. I need hardly add that I recognise that if such a scheme were devised, the working of the scheme must come under effective public control. But this does not mean the nationalisation or municipalisation of the means of transport. Well, the only other approach I am aware of is the National Socialist one. Do as I say, or I will hand over your business to my cronies. As it happens, London transport will be municipalised, as Ashfield puts it, in 1934. What this really all boils down to is that tubes are unprofitable. At least, they are unprofitable to the tube companies. They are very profitable to the owners of property near the stations. Anyway, that's all for this week. At this point, I believe I'm supposed to say something about liking and subscribing, if you're logged in, that is. In the meantime, I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.